Have you ever wished you could bring a photo of a dog to life on paper? Today I'm going to show you exactly how to make a dog look so realistic in pastels, you'll think you can reach out and pet it. I'm going to show you how I created the autofocus background, the base layers, the details, and the finishing touches, so this tutorial is packed with useful tips. And do you want to draw along with me? The full 7-hour tutorial is on my Patreon, split into focus sections so each step is easy to follow. The link can be found in the description and also in the pinned comment. For the background, I manually used soft pastels along with a few pastel pencils. I started by applying a base layer with a soft pastel green, then blended it using a sponge tool called a soft tool. As I built up the layers, I began adding more shades of green, including a vibrant yellow-green, some touches of blue and a bit of black, just enough to enhance depth and contrast. This helped create a strong sense of dimension in the background. As you can see, the dog appears to be in a forest or a park filled with trees, which is why the background is mostly green. It's an autofocus background, meaning everything is softly blurred, with shapes visible only in general form and with dreamy, diffused edges. I built these layers carefully to avoid filling the paper's texture too quickly. Even though there are no details elements on top, I still want to leave room in the paper's texture for any final touches if needed. As mentioned, I use sponge tools, both small and large, to apply and blend the pastel pigments, and I also wear a nitrile glove when blending with my fingers. Wearing a glove prevents the pastel pigment from mixing with my natural oils from the skin, which could dull its vibrancy. I tried to include as many colors as I could see in the reference picture, just to make the background more interesting, while keeping it accurate to the original image. For the ears, I started by applying a base layer to the ears and the darker areas of the face, on both sides, just to get some pigment down and make it easier to build up layers later. For this, I used a soft pastel in a mix of liver and Payne's gray, which works perfectly for a base layer in these areas. If I had used pure black, the result would have looked too flat and it would have been harder to add clean, bright highlights later on. Then I went back to the ears and deepened the shadows using a very dark gray pencil. After that, I added some warmth inside the ears with brown and flesh pink tones, making sure not to use anything too bright or pastel-y, since an overly vibrant pink can make the skin look irritated. Instead, I stuck with natural, nude-like pinks that better resemble real skin tones. At this stage, my focus is mainly on forms, tones, contrast, and proportions. I'm also careful not to overload the paper with pigment, since unlike the background, these areas will later include a lot of fine details, so preserving the paper's texture is important. For blending, I used again sponges and my fingers, but very gently to avoid mixing the darker areas too much with the warmer ones. When creating a base layer, it's always best to keep it slightly darker than the details that will come on top. That way, those details will stand out clearly later. The more thoughtfully you build up your layers, the easier it becomes to add realistic details afterwards, as they will adhere better to the paper's texture. The forehead is mostly white, so there wasn't much to do here, besides adding a bit of white soft pastel pigment and pressing it gently into the paper's texture with a sponge. As you can see, the pigment never stays as bright as when it's first applied. It always becomes slightly duller, especially with whites. This happens because the tiny pastel particles settle into the paper's texture and spread out, turning the pure white into more of an eggshell color. The pigment disperses rather than sitting on the surface. However, this actually works in my favor, since I need a darker base layer. It's perfect for adding those bright white fur details later on, which will stand out beautifully against the softer, toned down foundation. For the left and right sides of the face, I used the same dark gray as in the ears to mark the folds and wrinkles typical for this dog breed. This step is mainly to map out their placement, so I'll know exactly where to refine them later when adding details. In the areas that are very dark, I also added just a touch of black. However, black pigment loses some of its intensity when blended with other layers and colors. That's actually again a good thing. I don't want those deep, pure blacks yet. Those are reserved for the final detailing stage, where I'll need strong, rich shadows. While adding and blending these layers, I'm careful not to go too close to the eye area to avoid losing their shape. I try to keep those two spots as clean as possible, since the sketch lines are still visible there, and covering them with too much pigment would make it harder to refine them later. Even at this early stage, with just the base layers down, the structure of the face is already starting to appear. That's because of the contrast. Even without details, good contrast alone helps define forms and gives the drawing a sense of realism. For the muzzle's base layer, I took the same approach as with the forehead. A quick layer of white soft pastel blended with a sponge. The same thing happened here. The area shifted from pure white to an actual tone. However, as you can see, the sketch lines underneath are still visible. That's because the first layer is very thin and also because I used a sketching material that isn't easily covered by pastel pigment. In fact, the more layers I add later, the more those sketch lines will subtly show through, helping to guide me with the details later on. At this stage, my goal was simply to create an even base of the same color and thickness, just enough to cover the area lightly and let the sketch show through to guide me in the next steps. For the nose, I used a burgundy color and covered the nose area and its surroundings just to mark their placement in the drawing. I don't add too many layers to the nose area yet, since I'll be working on it all at once later on when I start adding the details. Here, I mainly used my fingers for blending because, with the white base layer underneath, the burgundy pigment blended beautifully with it. The nitrile glove I wear on my fingers really helps mix the two pigments beautifully and smoothly without dulling their intensity. Sometimes when using a sponge, you can end up moving the pigment around instead of actually blending it, so it's important to choose the right tool for each situation. This kind of decision comes with practice and experience. I've learned to trial and error what works best in the different cases, and those small lessons make a big difference in the final result. The chin area contains a lot of different colors, a mix of brown, flesh pink, salmon, and gray. A real cocktail that can easily turn into a muddy mess if not applied carefully and in the right order. I had to pay close attention to the reference photo to capture as many of those subtle folds as possible and to balance the light and dark areas without letting either overpower the whole section. As seen in the reference picture, this dog's chin is full of intricate details and color variations, so getting the base layer right is essential. A well-made base layer ensures that when I start adding details later, the colors will make sense together and the final result will look natural and cohesive. For the lip area, I focused only on the upper and lower parts, using a dark Payne's gray pencil to create the base layers. I haven't touched the middle section a lot yet, the part that has that wet, shiny look, since I'll work on it later when I move on to the detailing stage, just like with the nose. For now, I simply applied some pigment to the top and bottom edges of the lip and also a bit in the middle and blended it slightly to cover the paper's color. I decided to leave the small middle area for later because it's so tiny that it doesn't really need a base layer. It can be built up quickly with pencils during the detail phase, the same way I'll approach the nose. It took a lot of restraint not to start working on that shiny lip effect right away, since creating those kind of details that bring a drawing to life is honestly one of my favorite parts of the whole process. This chest area is quite large, almost the size of the entire head, but it's not very complex in terms of colors or structure, since it's mostly white with a few shadows under the head and across the chest. I used the same white soft pastel to cover the entire area, then added touches of gray, brown, salmon, and light umber in the shadowed parts to give the chest some structure and keep the tones looking natural. Which is why I emphasized the shaded areas to suggest the muscle definition. In the reference photo, some of those shadows pick up a bit of the green from the background, but I chose not to include that. It didn't look natural against the white fur in my opinion. Instead, I focused on neutral browns and grays to keep it realistic. These base layers act like a map you create for your future self, something you'll be grateful for later because it makes the next steps easier and speeds up the whole drawing process. That's how Pastel works. You need a darker base underneath to bring the fur to life later on, making sure the base and detail colors stay in the same tonal family. So try to use the same colors for the base layers and also for the details later on. For blending, I mostly use my fingers since it's a large area, and fingers work as a wide blending tool. Of course, I used the nitrile gloves for that. I made sure to clean my fingers, even when wearing the nitrile gloves, using a microfiber cloth between color transitions to avoid muddying the pigments. I also paid close attention to the contrast in the darker areas, but I didn't make all of them equally deep because I want to create some variations. This will help later on when I start layering the fur with pencils, knowing exactly where to add more layers for darker patches and where to keep a lighter touch for softer fur transitions. Now that all the base layers are in place and looking good, it's time to start adding the details. I began with the ears again, since I always work from top to bottom. Following the base layer as a guide, I started creating the fur using very short pencil strokes to mimic the look of short fur. I used the same pencils as for the base layer to keep the colors consistent, especially inside the ears where the tones are slightly more vibrant. I'm not trying to draw every single hair visible in the reference photo. My goal here is to build contrast between the dark outer area of the ear and the lighter, warmer tones inside it. I also added some highlights along the edges of the ears to make them stand out more and to bring a touch of light to those areas. These small details works beautifully against the darker background, instantly bringing the ears to life. Those highlights represent the light hitting the edges directly. Since the upper part of the ear looked a bit too flat and too dark, I added a few subtle gray fur strands to break up that solid black effect and introduce some texture and depth. I made sure to keep those strokes fine and minimal so the ears stay proportional and don't appear oversized or cartoonish. Even though the ears might seem similar at first glance, they're actually quite different. The lighting falls differently on each one, so it's important not to copy one ear onto the other. Instead, carefully observe the reference picture and recreate what you see rather than what you think should be there. Of course, the colors and textures remain consistent, but the way they are arranged and how the light interacts with each ear varies, giving each ear its own subtle character and realism. In my opinion, the eyes are one of the most important features in a portrait. They bring the drawing to life, reveal the animal's personality, and makes this pet itself not just another dog of the same breed. This pup's eyes are mostly black with a few grays and white highlights. They aren't overly complex, but you must preserve the highlight area when laying in the black color of the iris. If you cover the highlight area with thick, intense black, you won't get a pure white highlight later. At best, you'll get a dull gray because the paper's texture will be filled with pastel pigment. That crisp, pure white sparkle is vital, so leave the highlight area untouched. I started by filling the pupil with black, then refined the highlights with some gray and white. At this stage, the eyes can look odd, because they are deep black with little contrast around them, but that will change once strong shadows and highlights are added to the rest of the portrait. While working, I constantly check the reference, measuring the spacing between the eyes, their size, and comparing those proportions to my drawing. It's easy to get tunnel vision and overwork an area, then realize later on that something's off, so don't move on until each section looks right. Spend 5 extra minutes analyzing and stepping back to view every section, but also the piece as a whole. It takes little time but makes a huge difference in the final result. The nose is another very important feature for this dog breed, since French Bulldogs are easily recognized by their flat noses, which unfortunately is also what causes them breathing difficulties because their nostrils are so narrow. It's quite sad, but I wanted to capture that characteristic look in my drawing, to give the nose that flat appearance while also creating the realistic texture that the dog noses naturally have, those tiny circular pores that give them their distinctive surface. I made sure my pencil was very sharp to draw that texture and used small circular motions, layering circles over each other to build the effect. In the darker areas, I simply added more layers to deepen the tone. For the colors, I used shades of burgundy, gray, pink, and of course, black for the nostrils. I avoided using strong highlights here because I didn't want the nose to look overly shiny or wet. That wouldn't even match the reference photo. Instead, I kept everything subtle and realistic. I also made sure that the shadow above the nose, that small fold, was dark enough to make the nose appear raised and three-dimensional. That shadow helped soften the harsh upper contour line of the nose so it would blend naturally into the face rather than looking like it was just pasted onto the drawing. Finally, I added a few light gray highlights below the nose to enhance the flat nose effect. Those highlights, together with the shadows above, push the nose forward visually and help achieve that realistic, flattened look. Since this is a small and detailed area, I worked almost entirely with pencils. Using blending tools here would risk smudging or erasing the fine textures I had carefully drawn, so I chose to rely only on pencils for the entire process. For this part of the lip, I really wanted to achieve that wet, glossy look and strong contrast with the darker areas above and below it, which helps the lip stand out even more. I started by working on the upper and lower areas first to preserve the highlight in the center of the lip. By darkening the surrounding areas first, it becomes much easier later to judge how bright and strong the middle highlight should be, since it will naturally pop against the darker tones. If I had started with the middle section, I wouldn't have been able to properly balance the highlight because the surrounding contrast wouldn't be there yet. As I mentioned, my goal here was to create a soft and shiny effect that instantly adds realism to the drawing, similar to how the eyes bring life with their glossy, reflective look. I also added a few light and dark details around the lip to avoid those areas looking like flat black patches. These subtle touches suggest the presence of tiny, fine hairs scattered all around the muzzle. Of course, I didn't go overboard trying to make them hyper-realistic, just added a few here and there to bring in a bit of texture and contrast, just enough to make the area feel natural and alive. For the head, I started working on the details on the left side of the face. For the highlights, I used shades of brown and gray, and for the shadows, I used black. My main focus here was on creating those characteristic wrinkles of this dog breed. I built a strong contrast between the darker areas, which have almost no visible texture because they are so deep in shadow, and the highlighted fur strands that catch the light. Together, these two elements created a realistic wrinkle effect. I used short pencil strokes, carefully layering them to build a short fur texture. Since this breed has very short fur, I had to be mindful not to make the strokes too long or it will just ruin the effect. In this area, the contrast is very strong. The dark and light zones emphasize each other beautifully, enhancing both the folds and the underlying bone structure, which is quite prominent in French bulldogs, especially around the jawline. I also added subtle pinkish flesh tones above the eye and below it to give the dog a more expressive, serious look and to open up the eye area a bit. Along with those highlights, I also darkened parts around the eye to balance the intensity of the black and make the eye blend naturally into the rest of the drawing. Here and there, I did some light glazing using a Payne's Gray pencil to slightly tone down a few of the highlights that looked a bit too pink. Glazing is actually a simple but very effective technique. It means applying a thin, light layer of pigment over an existing one to adjust its tone, either darkening or slightly shifting the color without covering it completely. And a little tip, to avoid applying too much pressure during glazing, hold your pencil farther from the tip. This reduces control slightly but helps you apply lighter, more delicate strokes automatically. I didn't use pure white for the highlights as I wanted to keep the area soft and avoid overcrowding it with too much brightness. Maintaining that smooth, natural look was more important to me. The most important things when drawing fur are getting the correct length of the strokes, following the fur's growth direction, choosing accurate colors, and maintaining balanced contrast. All of these elements together make the fur look realistic and lifelike. The forehead is mostly white at the top, with some visible fur texture lower down where it meets the fold above the nose, and a darker area around the eye. In the upper part, where the light is so strong that almost no details are visible, I pressed a bit harder with the pastel to fill that area evenly without worrying too much about texture. As I moved toward the lower section, I used the earlier base layer to help create the look of white fur. Since that base layer was slightly darker, the white strands drawn over it stood out nicely, creating a layered fur effect, which I also wanted. Using a dark gray pencil, I added a few short fur strokes near the eyes and above the fold to increase contrast and draw more attention to that area. There wasn't much work required here, but I had to be very careful not to overdo it. I didn't want the forehead to look like a flat white patch with no texture and depth. Balancing just a bit of contrast and subtle fur detail was key to keeping the area soft but still realistic. On the right side of the head, I followed the same steps and techniques as on the left side. I made sure to keep rotating the pencil in my hand, so I was always using the sharpest part of the tip. This is a very useful and important trick for achieving that soft, fine fur. If you don't rotate the pencil regularly and you keep using the same edge of the tip, it will gradually wear down and become flat, which will make the strokes thicker and eventually erase the short fur effect, especially when working on a small drawing where a sharp point is very essential. This side of the face is also darker than the other one, so it required a bit less work, but I was careful not to overdo the dark areas. I added some subtle fur texture within the shadows to prevent the area from looking too flat, cartoony or unnatural. There were also some slight blue tones in this part of the face, unlike the left side. However, I chose a blue shade that leaned more toward gray. Using a vibrant blue would have looked unnatural. Of course, black fur can reflect different types of colors in the highlights, but personally, I prefer to keep it subtle and not to use overly bright tones. As with the other areas, I focused on building the fur gradually in layers, keeping the texture soft and maintaining that realistic short fur appearance. The cheek area is quite large in this portrait. It's filled with short white fur, many folds, and a lot of texture. Before starting, I sharpened my pencil carefully to make sure the short white fur strokes would come out clean and defined. I also added some burgundy tones in the darker fur patches and a few nude pink shades, making sure again not to use colors that would make the skin look irritated. Where the edge of the cheeks meets the darker areas of the face, I drew a few stray white hairs overlapping into the black zone to add a bit of softness and fluffiness. This helps the cheek appear to sit in front of the darker areas, which is enhancing the depth and the realism. I wanted to create a small point of interest in this area by emphasizing the dark areas from which the whiskers grow. The tricky part though was the whiskers. They're almost pure white, just like the fur around them, so they're practically invisible. I chose not to invent or exaggerate them, especially since this is a commission piece. Adding whiskers from my imagination could have changed the dog's appearance too much and make it less recognizable to the owner. I also worked a bit on the dark section in the middle, adding shadows, highlights, and a touch of texture to blend everything smoothly. The left side is entirely white, while the right one has a darker section that I refined earlier when working on the right side of the head. I made sure both sides looked balanced and that the dark patch on the right side blended naturally into the white area, so they form a whole area. In conclusion, for this area, I focused mainly on creating short, white, fine strands of fur to build up texture and give that area a soft, slightly fluffy appearance around the edges. The chin area was really interesting to work on because it was full of color. Shades of salmon, brown, gray, and a touch of black. as well as a lot of texture. The fur here is very short and required careful, meticulous work. In the reference photo, there were also some subtle green tones, but again I decided not to include them since I was worried they might make the area look unnatural. The chin also has several folds and wrinkles, so I made sure to study the reference picture carefully and place them exactly where they belonged without getting carried away and adding too many or too few. For the shadows, I used dark brown and dark gray, while for the highlights, I used a combination of a flesh pink tone and white for the final touches to give the chin a slight shine. I avoided using too much black because that would have made the folds look too harsh and deep, which could create an unnatural, abrupt transition between the tones. When adding such small fine details, it's important to keep rotating the pencil and hold it close to the tip. This gives you better control over the pressure and helps you make shorter, more precise strokes. It's a very useful tip to keep in mind. We often focus so much on how the pencil looks on paper that we forget to think about how we move our hand and control the tool. In the end, you control the pencil, not the other way around, and mastering that makes all the difference in the final result. Now let's move on to the last and largest area of this portrait, the chest. I started by adding texture to the darker areas first, keeping in mind that the fur here is longer, so my pencil strokes also needed to be longer to capture that effect. These dark zones in the reference photo had also some hints of green, but again I chose not to include them. Instead, I stuck with shades of brown, salmon and grey for a more natural look. Since this breed has a muscular build, the chest area clearly shows the shape of the muscles. I had to be careful though when adding shadows not to make the dog look overly muscular or exaggerated. My main focus was to make the fur look like it's overlapping the shadowed areas, creating the illusion that the fur itself is still white but appears darker only because of the shadows falling over it, not because that chest area actually has darker fur. In reality, this area is all white, but the lighting and shadows create that illusion of darker patches. The sides of the chest are much lighter, especially the left one, where the light is so strong that almost no details are visible. The right side, however, has more shadows, so the details are more visible there, and that's where I placed most of my attention. I also added some white pencil strokes into the darker zones to give them more texture and connect them visually to the lighter surrounding fur. Before I even started this section, I studied the direction of the fur growth, how it flows from the center of the chest outward towards the lighter area on both sides. If you look closely, the fur grows downward from under the chin, but as it moves toward the sides, it gradually shifts upward. This sudden change in direction makes the area visually interesting but also challenging to draw. Because a transition in fur direction is so abrupt, I had to plan ahead carefully to keep everything looking natural rather than too messy. It's important to think a few steps ahead when working on fur like this, so the strokes flow logically and don't end up looking random or chaotic. For the lighter side, the left one, I used a white pastel stick to block in the area without focusing on details. I just wanted to cover it smoothly. On the right, where the area has more fine details, I used a white pencil instead, since the pastel stick's white tip would have covered too much and made the fur look thick and uneven. The lower chest and belly area is mostly grey and is also the darkest part of this area. The sudden jump between the unfinished and finished parts of this section is because, of course, my camera didn't record that portion, so I lost the footage. However, in that area I only used dark grey and white to create the fur and the contrast. Overall, my goal in this section was to make the fur look soft and slightly longer than the fur on the head, also to use as many natural tones as possible to suggest the way the white fur reflects colors from around the dog's surroundings. I also paid attention to the placement of the shadows. I wanted the dog to look strong and muscular, but in a natural, balanced way, not like a bodybuilder. And that's it for this piece. I really hope you enjoyed watching the process and seeing how all the little layers and details came together to bring this adorable French bulldog to life. If you'd like to go deeper into the full process, I've uploaded the complete 7-hour real-time tutorial on my Patreon. In that version, I go step by step through everything, from the base layers to all the final touches, and explain my thought process in detail. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and hit that bell button so you don't miss any of my further videos. And as always, happy drawing, and I really hope I'm going to see you in my next video as well. Bye everyone!